Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
David, I'm afraid, can't be here for tonight. He's busy preparing for the big night. Over the next hour, our audience here in Edinburgh will put their questions to two party leaders. Neither are pretending they will be your next Prime Minister, but they could play a vital role in shaping the future of this country, indeed, its very existence. You can join in from home, of course, on Twitter, on Facebook and on text. The hashtag is BBCQT, as ever, and the text number to use 83981. Now, as ever, our guests have not seen the questions that they're about to face, and they draw lots to decide who should begin. So first, will you please welcome the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron. Good evening.
Good evening, Nick.
Good evening, Mr. Farron. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get our first question tonight, and it's from Marco Crolla.
Hi. We're under attack. If properly controlled, why is internet surveillance not a good thing? It can save lives.
OK, well, first of all, Marco, I mean, you, like everybody else, would have been here last night, but we, of course, rightly postponed to pay tribute to those who died, to remember those who have passed away and to stand in solidarity with their loved ones and all those injured and affected by the London attacks. And, you know, you think about what you're going to say before you come on a programme like this after an event as happened on Saturday night, and you remember yourself saying really similar things a fortnight earlier after the appalling outrage in Manchester. And to my mind, our reactions, maybe they're similar, mine, are heartbreak, the impact on those individuals and their families, and frankly, anger that this should happen to people in our community, that it should happen at all, such utter wickedness. And therefore, the desire for something to be done is utterly right. So my sense is what that something which is indeed. So here we go. Do we believe that the reason we have not been able to prevent outrages such as those on Saturday night and 2 weeks ago in Manchester was because of a lack of surveillance, or was it because of a lack of resources? It seems to me, for example, that we have at the moment the ability, the powers, our police have the powers, our security services have the powers to follow and track criminals, to be able to pursue terrorists, to be able to hack into their devices. What we don't have is sufficient pairs of eyes and pairs of hands in our security services and in our police force to be able to pursue them and to catch them. Now, I do not know what could be done to prevent three utter murderous cowards in a white van deciding to do what they did on Saturday night, but I do know that we are much safer if we invest in police and in our security services. The additional 300 million that the Liberal Democrats have put into policing across the country would make us safer. The cuts Theresa May's made over the last 7 years as Home Secretary and then Prime Minister have not made us safer.
Let's see whether Mr. Crolla is convinced by that.
I do feel that we are restricted, and the police are restricted in the surveillance that they can do. I think they should have more powers to be able to monitor these people, especially where data has been encrypted on mobile phones now. It's a new world we live in now.
Why, Mr. Farron, in your manifesto do you say, picking up on that point, that you would, quote, roll back state surveillance powers? It's not that you don't want new powers, you want fewer powers.
So we're talking about the Snoopers Charter or data surveillance, however you want to describe it. Now, here's the issue. When we're trying to deal with terrorists and suspected terrorists, we need to be able to focus on what they do and who they are talking to. What we have at the moment, if you like, is a ever-widening haystack, and we're looking for a needle. And the answer is not to put more hay into the haystack. It is to put more magnets around the haystack so we can actually find what's in there in the first place.
So just to be clear, you don't want those powers, you want them rolled back.
There are two things here. I have got a practical concern and a principal concern. The practical concern is this. Our security services utterly need the ability to be able to catch people and to trace people. But the widening of powers is not something that the evidence is there to support. So it is a practical problem. There is a principal issue, though.
Lady in the middle, Ms. Farron.
OK, all right.
You have said that the practical is to put more police effectively back on the beat again, that the Conservatives have gotten rid of 20,000 bobbies on the beat. Are you going to give them more than a big stick?
Well, let's just take some other views.
Yeah,
Lady here at the front. Lady here at the front.
OK.
One of the terrorists was actually known. He appeared on a ITV4 documentary.
Yeah, Channel 4.
Unveiling an ISIS flag. We have thousands of jihadis being allowed back into this country. Why are they being allowed back into the country, and why are we not interning the people who we know are problematic?
Okay.
And there's a gentleman at the front here.
OK.
Yeah, just I don't want to feel like the thing's too reactionary, and you know, we're just taking this for like one issue to strengthen terrorism. Really, I think against terrorism. Terrorism, by its own mindset, is basically to create fear, to create a panic, to create a reaction. Strengthening sort of views like that might be, you know, used in the wrong way.
OK.
Yeah.
So, big stick we were hearing about. Is that what you're going to give?
So we need to have resources. I mean, Cressida Dick said today that she did not favour and didn't think it would make us a safer country if we armed every officer in the UK. I agree with her, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have more resources. And of that £300 million the Liberal Democrats would give to our police forces, some of that would, of course, go to ensuring we did have that capability. There's a question about people being allowed back in the country, and that's a really good question, given that we had a question about the powers that we do or don't need. So the government has, the Home Secretary has, the power to issue temporary exclusion orders. In the last 2 years, she's used one in those 2 years. And we know of people who potentially could have been stopped. So it's not, do we have the powers? It's, do we use the powers?
Well, it's not just that, Mr. Farron, is it? Because you say in your manifesto you want to roll back powers. You opposed powers for the security services to read encrypted messages. You opposed checking internet history. You opposed the anti-radicalisation prevent strategy. You once talked about a paranoid authoritarian state. You are the no new powers man, are you not?
We are the party that wants to back our police to have the resources to actually do something about it. Because at times like this, it's very easy and tempting for a politician to come up with a knee-jerk, sounds good response. I want to do some good. I realise at this point people are seeking answers and want to see action. But for example, you talked about the anti-radicalisation strategy, and you asked the question before about people we know about and aren't tackling. We know that the murderer in Manchester was reported by his community on 5 separate occasions. That is a reminder that the community out there are desperate to tackle terrorism, and our police and security services do not have the resources to enable them to do it. That's where the priority must be.
So even if they say they want more powers, the police and security services, you say, well, no, you're wrong about that. You can have more money, but you can't have more powers.
If you listen to the police and security services, what they want more than anything else is the resources to catch people. There's also, though, a point made here. What do the terrorists want us to do? To turn in on ourselves and be divided as a country. What do they want us to do? To give up on our freedoms and our liberties. And those are the things we must not sacrifice, otherwise the terrorists would have won.
Okay. Our next question, please. So changing the subject, moving on to the issue of Brexit. Ashley Wilkes, please.
Is your second referendum strategy in any way respecting the will of the British people?
I always think that if you believe in people having a vote, that's generally quite democratic. I take the view that the result last June, 52-48, as narrow as it was, nevertheless, the government has the mandate to negotiate Brexit, and that's the direction the country is going in. If I'm honest with you, it breaks my heart. I'm somebody who believed that Britain would still be better at the heart of the European Union. Nevertheless, I accept that is the narrow will of the people. The thing is this, though, what happens next? Now, one might argue that Theresa May has called the election as early as she has, despite the fact she already has a clear majority in Parliament because Labour backed her. She's called it now before the details of Brexit become clear. And that plan, that deal that Theresa May and indeed the European leaders will negotiate, will impact upon all of our lives. The younger we are, for the longer, and it will impact upon our prices that we pay at the supermarket, on jobs and everything else. The simple point here, Nick, if I can just finish, I apologise before we come back and you can tell me I'm right or wrong. It's simply this, that deal we'll have to live with for the next several generations will either get signed off by the politicians or by the people. Now, what if it's a bad deal? And I mean dementia tax bad, that kind of bad. And if it's that bad, shouldn't you have the final say and not the politicians in vape-filled rooms in Brussels and London?
Ashley Works, it was your question.
We're having the general election so we can decide who's got to give us the best deal going forward. Why do we need to have another referendum to say whether we've got to take the deal or not?
Do you mind me asking you, Ashley, which way did you vote in the referendum?
Me, I voted to leave.
You voted to leave, OK.
Yes.
Gentleman just down here.
Second referendum, Tim, for the EU. Why not a second referendum for Scotland?
OK.
Gentleman here.
Tim, both Scotland and Northern Ireland, as you well know, voted overwhelmingly Remain. We are partners, equal partners of the Union. We're not regions. So do you support Nicola Sturgeon being at the top table for Brexit negotiations?
Well, let's come back to the issues here, particularly in Scotland, in just a second and deal with Ashley's point first of all, which is she thinks you're not listening to the will of the people. What part of no don't you understand, Mr. Farron?
I mean, fundamentally, my view, I'm a Democrat. I don't believe...
Well, you're not a Democrat, are you? Because what you say is there was a vote and you want to have another one.
Well, we had a general election 2 years ago and we appear to be having another one. And my... You know, so I absolutely accept the result of the referendum. The people I blame for the situation we've got ourselves in are David Cameron and George Osborne, who took a chance in our country's future, and our children will pay for it. And they were on the Remain side. So I blame them if I blame anybody. We are, as a country, learning to deal with our new future, and we must do that together. However, that deal that none of us know the contents of will be stitched up behind closed doors by Brussels and London. I simply say that final deal is going to be stitched up, or rather decided, endorsed by someone. Either it is the politicians or it's the people. I think it's ultimately democratic to say that it must be the people.
I do want to come back to the question you're asking.
And the Scotland question.
Forgive me, we'll come back to it. I promise we will,
the difference between the two positions.
Let's just carry on, though, on the Brexit position, whether people think you are or are not listening to the will of the people. Sir, have you got a point to make on that?
Doesn't it just underline that an in-out yes-no referendum is a very blunt instrument to make really big constitutional decisions over?
Can I be honest with you and say that I'm not an enormous fan of referenda, but I think if you started with democracy, you can't end up with a stitch-up. And I think that we voted for departure last June, but we didn't vote for destination. It wasn't on the ballot paper. The only person I blame for that is David Cameron. Nobody's fault apart from his. But we've started with democracy. We can't now end this process with a stitch-up. And after that, I'll be happy we had no more referenda ever.
One minute at the back there.
Right, you know, I'm a young person. I've just come back from living in the European Union. And I really feel like I'm being shut out of this debate about free movement, about losing free movement would be so damaging to my life chances. And why shouldn't I get a say on what kind of Brexit I want to see?
Well, I think Mr. Farron's going to agree with that, isn't he?
I do. As a little reminder, it's an absolutely brilliant point. It is two things I just want to say. First of all, the majority voted out. That is the result. That's the direction of the country. But all of us, especially our leaders, must not forget that 3/4 of our young people voted for Remain, and they will have to live with the consequences of this for longer than most of us. And the second point, freedom of movement is often raised. But what about freedom of movement for British people? Our ability to live, work and study, love and explore overseas. These things matter too, and that's why the content of the deal should be agreed by the people, not the politicians.
But forgive me, these are the arguments you put in the referendum and you defeated. Now, 48% of the population voted Remain. Nobody quite trusts opinion polls at the moment. Not one of them has you above 10%. This is not exactly a popular cause, is it?
So, cliché klaxon number one, the only poll that matters is the one on Thursday. But it's right, isn't it?
If people really wanted what you wanted, you'd be a very popular man, wouldn't you?
Well, there's a good question. I'm sure that may be so. First of all, doing what you believe in is the right thing to do. Some people may think that we take a calculation over our position on this matter, on democracy, for the final deal. Do you know one major motivation? is that in 30 years' time, when my kids are my age, I want to look them in the eye and tell them I did everything I could to protect their future. That is what being in politics should be about, not narrow calculations.
Now, I stopped you when you were... Gentleman at the front here asked you whether... Put your question again.
About the Scottish referendum.
About the Scottish referendum.
Yeah.
A second referendum's OK for Europe, but it's not good enough for the people of Scotland.
Oh.
And we were promised the only way we could stay in Europe was by voting no.
OK, so the answer to this question starts with me saying something nice about Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Wait for it. So, nearly 3 years ago, when Scotland had the chance to vote to leave the United Kingdom, the SNP, or in particular the then First Minister Alex Salmond, produced a 650-page white paper showing what leaving the United Kingdom would look like for Scotland. And 12 months ago, Nigel Farage presented us with a lie on the side of a bus. They are not comparable. They are not comparable. So the Scottish people voted in that referendum, knowing not just departure, but destination also. And indeed, my party...
They had no idea of the destination because Britain had not elected a Conservative government that was committed to have a referendum that eventually took us out of the EU. So, in fact, the people of Scotland voted short on the basis of a false prospectus.
But the argument is, of course...
So if you're a Democrat, why not give them another go?
So I fully respect whatever people feel on both sides of the issue on independence. I'm bound to say, as a northerner, it breaks my heart the thought that you want to leave us lot saddled with the Tories. Please don't go. But the second thing I'd just say on this is that we as a party stood in the Holyrood elections, the Scottish parliamentary elections last May, on a manifesto committed to Scotland as part of the United Kingdom. And so, keeping to our mandate, it's right that we say that we continue to support the Union and there not being a rerun of the Scottish referendum.
Take a couple of quick points from the audience. Yeah.
In 2014, Scotland was told that if it wanted to stay in the EU, it would have to vote no. So Scotland voted no and endorsed the EU. In 2016, Scotland voted to remain in the EU. Twice in 2 years, Scotland has endorsed the EU. Surely the only way for Scotland to get a route back into the EU is to become an independent country.
Just a small point. Yep. Please.
Would you not agree that there's misinformation on either side of these referenda, though? There's certainly misinformation from the EU, and there was misinformation from the No campaign with regards to what we would get if we stayed in the UK.
Final quick point. Yep.
You have less than 10 seats now. You'll have less than 10 seats in a week's time. What's the point in a vote for the Liberal platitudes?
Thank you very much. OK. So there are, if the polling is to be believed, that 1/3 of the folks in here support the SNP, and enough respect to all of you. And 2 years ago, you had 6 MPs. And whether you like it or not, whether I like it or not, you've made a significant difference in that time. So they don't write off people because they've got a current number of MPs in single digits. There was a bunch of questions at the back about what happens next and all of the rest of it. My view is simply this. As somebody who is a northerner, who is committed to my collective British identity and want us to be a united kingdom, I utterly respect those who believe in independence, but I politely disagree. The issue about there being untruths or wrong arguments on either side. Do you know what? I mean, I am most critical about the arguments used by those at the top of the Remain campaign.
Yeah, but they're asking about a Scotland independence referendum.
We're talking about misuse of information.
Yeah, but I think they're asking, well, give them misuse, why won't you give them a Scotland referendum again?
Well, I think I've explained that.
OK, well,
but I think you asked me a question about people giving wrong arguments and all the rest of it. Can I point out at the moment, I'm fairly sure that Remain lost the referendum last year, and it was the moment when George Osborne, who I should now be nice to, because of course he may or may not print my press releases, but he pointed out that if you leave the European Union, you'd lose your foreign holiday, you'd lose your savings, you'd lose your pension, you'd lose your job. There's a whole bunch of people in this country who thought, I've got none of them, stuff you. And I think we need to remember that the arguments for Remain were not the emotional inspiring ones that should have been used. If they had been deployed, we could well have won.
Forgive me, that's the history. Let's move on. Yes, question. A new question, please, if we could, from Anne Traherne.
Yes, do you feel conflicted between your faith and your policies?
Not in the slightest. I mean, my identity, like most of you in here, is is multiple in the sense I'm a father. Yes, I'm a Christian. I'm a northerner, not as northerly as most of you, but I count myself as a northerner. And I'm a Liberal Democrat. I can be facetious and say I'm a Blackburn Rovers fan. All these things make up who I am. And we are all that blend of different identities. And I believe somebody who lives in a society like this, which is so diverse and so balanced, that I couldn't want to pick another country in the world to be in.
But you know why the question's being asked, don't
freedom.
You know why the question's being asked. The question's being asked because you've been asked again and again, and you may consider it an unfair question, but you've often been asked whether you regard homosexuality as a sin.
So no.
And you've not wanted to answer the question.
So no is the answer to that question. But the issue is...
No, you don't think it's a sin?
No. But the point
Do you think abortion is wrong, is the other question that's asked?
So the question is, do you act in a way because of what you believe sincerely in your heart, in a liberal fashion, and defend people's rights? So I joined the Liberal Party, as it was then, when I was 16. One of the very first campaigns I was involved in was trying to abolish and get rid of Section 28. Okay. That homophobic piece of legislation was introduced by the Conservative government at that time. And right through my time, passionate for LGBT plus rights, particularly most recently when we were in coalition government, introducing equal marriage. That is massively important to me, but the job is not finished.
Well, he's been very clear. It says there is no conflict. He doesn't regard homosexuality as a sin. How do you feel?
You answered the earlier question by saying you've got to do what you believe in. And so you have been very active in LGBT and you've voted in favour of gay marriage, which I'm impressed by. I respect that. That must be very difficult with a Christian evangelical background.
No. If you're a Liberal, you fight for everybody's right to be who they are. And I honestly don't understand the conflict that people think is there. Yes, people
Why was it so hard to answer the question?
Because, you know, I'm not somebody who wants to go around talking about my faith all the time. I've never made it...
No, but you've had lots of interviews. You must have been very tempted to say, let's just have done with this and answer it.
Or you could actually take the view that I'm not running to be Pope and that you are somebody who believes that I am not... I am a political leader, not a religious one. So I don't judge anybody. Utterly key to my faith, for what it's worth, is you treat others as you want to be treated yourself. You do not judge other people, otherwise you yourself will be judged.
We're going to move on to another subject and another question. Thank you very much indeed for that. Frank Donnelly.
Do you think people should trust the Liberal Democrats after the U-turn mutation fees that left them in tatters?
Well, so I am the leader of the Liberal Democrats. I made a promise to my constituents by signing that pledge in 2015 to vote against an increase in tuition fees, and I kept my pledge. You can argue it cost me a place in, as a minister during that time of the coalition government. It's important to keep your promises. It is also important to do what is right by the people that you represent. Whatever one thinks about tuition fees, I can tell you from my experience as a working class lad who got to university in the late 1980s, what helped me to get to university was the simple fact that I got a maintenance award. And that was what made the difference between me being able to afford, and my folks being able to afford, me to go to university. That is what the Liberal Democrats are committed to replacing, bringing in a £7,000 a year maintenance award, so folks like me and many people in the United Kingdom can actually afford to go to university.
Frank Donnelly, are you convinced by that answer?
Well, I'm just thinking if the Conservatives don't get the majority that they need, and there's another coalition, how many of the pledges that you've made just now will be turned over?
Well, we're not going to coalition. I made that very, very clear. I mean, first of all, whether one likes it or not, Theresa May is heading for a landslide on Thursday. I wish she wasn't, but she called the election.
You just told us you didn't believe the polls, and you shouldn't trust the polls. So how on earth do you know she's running for a landslide?
There you go. You got me. You got me. But So, Nick, you got me. But I think that one assumes nobody calls an election at the point that she did. If she did not assume, maybe she's taking us all for granted that that will be the outcome. Either way, though, either way, we've been very clear. We will not be going into coalition with any party after this election. You can still make a massive difference in opposition. Here in Scotland, quite a good example is the SNP government, just short of a majority here. The Liberal Democrats are not in coalition or any partnership or pact with the SNP government. We stay in opposition and we make a difference from the opposite side. If you want, for example, to stop the dementia tax, cuts in education and in hospitals, then being in opposition gives you the chance to prevent all of those things.
We're going to move on in a second, but just on tuition fees, there's a slightly puzzling thing here. Your party promised to scrap fees at an election, but you introduced them. You voted against fees.
I did.
Yeah, but you now say that you'll keep them because they're fairer. Is it any wonder that people find it hard to trust your party?
No, because it was about trust and not fees. That issue was always about trust and not fees. On the detail of the policy, by the way, as things now are in England, you have to be earning £70,000 a year now before the new system that we introduced is more expensive for you than the one that was replaced by Labour. So it's about making things better. The priority for us is bringing back maintenance grants so working-class kids can go to university in larger numbers.
Just time to get in another subject, and I'm going to ask Josh West to ask a question.
How can the Liberal Democrats justify making every taxpayer pay an extra 1p in tax?
Well, first of all, we absolutely are proud of saying that we are going to be honest with all of you, that the NHS and social care across the United Kingdom is in crisis, and in England especially, I would observe, and that means that either you can have platitudes from people who will tell you that they can solve this problem without any extra money, or we can be brutally honest with you and say that for the price of a cup of coffee a week, we can have the best NHS and social care in the world. My view is this, that there isn't a single person who either themselves or their loved ones uses health and care in this country and doesn't know there is a crisis. In social care, you have wonderful, loving people, caring for our older people who could earn more money stacking shelves at the local supermarket. That is an absolute outrage, and I'm determined to solve it, and we'll solve it by being honest and saying that we'll put a penny on income tax for everybody to make sure we have the best health and social care in the world.
Just spell that out a bit more, if you would. You say it's the price of a cup of coffee a week. Take a police constable, for example. How much would your 1p tax rise cost them?
An average earner, it would cost £2.50 a week. So that's not nothing.
Police constable with £235 a year
over a year,
extra
yeah. So
at a time when real incomes are going down.
So isn't that all the more important that we're very, very clear that what we're doing is something that's going to make a massive difference? You can do banal offers that you know you're never going to keep, or you make a commitment
you tax the rich,
that is
or you tax
fully,
businesses, for example.
50%, the 50% best paid people in this country would be paying 95% of the burden. But this is a colossal problem, and either we solve it or we don't. And the Liberal Democrats have a plan to solve it, and we're going to be honest with you and tell you how we'll pay for it.
You say.
Saying it's 1p. It's not 1p at all. It's 1%.
Yeah.
The second thing, you mentioned dementia tax. It's nothing to do with dementia, and it is not a tax. How are you going to raise the money for the elderly if those who can pay do pay?
So there's a great point. And first of all, you are right to say that calling it the dementia tax, Theresa May's dementia tax, does not fully explain the situation. Because people with multiple sclerosis...
What he says is there's nothing to do with dementia. He says it's not a tax.
Well,
we're short of time, so briefly...
It's got everything to do. What Theresa May is planning to do is to say to everybody in this country who gets a long-term condition, whether it be Alzheimer's or multiple sclerosis or whatever it might be, that if you have to get care, then your spouse or your children, that house will have to go on the point of your death. That is not something that is the case now. Theresa May says there will be a cap, but she says, give me a colossal majority first, and then I'll tell you what it's going to be. And
so
Thursday,
let me just be clear with you. You think it is fairer, do you, for somebody who works in McDonald's or cleans a hospital to have to pay in their taxes instead of someone who has quite a prosperous background and has a house to pay for their own care?
So we believe there should be a cap in terms of what you pay for care. That £72,000 cap that once upon a time was a cross-party solution under Andrew Dilnot. We believe the dementia tax is an appalling attack on the most vulnerable people in this country.
Mr. Farron.
9 out of 10 houses will pay for it. If you have dementia or your loved one has dementia, your house is at risk. And on Thursday you've got the chance to vote to stop it, to vote Liberal Democrat.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to Tim Farron. Thank you. Sorry to cut Mr. Farron off there, but we need to be fair to our next guest as well. And please now welcome the leader of the Scottish National Party, the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Good evening, First Minister. Hello. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's get our first question this evening, and it comes from Anne Goodall.
What can our politicians do to make our streets safe again?
Well, it's possibly the question that is uppermost in everybody's mind right now, and of course all of our thoughts remain with those affected by that horrific and cowardly attack in the centre of London on Saturday night, and of course with the people of Manchester as well. This is one of the greatest responsibilities for any politician, and I think the first thing politicians need to do is be honest. There are no easy answers, and often the knee-jerk responses are the wrong ones. Firstly, we've got to tackle and address and challenge extremism wherever we find it. And I believe very strongly that we have to do that with the Muslim community. We mustn't scapegoat the Muslim community because it's wrong. Most Muslims are as appalled at these attacks as the rest of us. But it would also be counterproductive because we're going to find it easier to root out extremism if we're working in partnership with that community. Secondly, we've got to make sure we invest in our security and intelligence services, and we've got to make sure we invest in our police. Obviously, one of the big issues of debate today has been the reduction in police numbers in England, 20,000 fewer police officers. In Scotland, we've maintained police numbers and we've increased the numbers of police officers who are trained to bear firearms. So after the Manchester attack, Police Scotland was able to have an increased level of policing from within its own resources without calling on the military, although we're very grateful for the offer of help from the military. So these are the things we've got to do. Two final points I would make are these. I've made one of them already about not scapegoating particular communities. But secondly, we must make sure that in our determination, and all of us share it, to keep the population safe, we don't start to undermine our own freedoms and civil liberties, because these are part of what makes us who we are.
Is
and
that
if we start
code,
to do
if you
that,
don't mind me asking for saying don't give new powers to the police and security services?
I think we should always listen very carefully to what the police and the security services say, but the police and security services already have fairly wide-ranging powers. I listened to some of your conversations with Tim Farron.
They have, as you know, asked for new powers, haven't they, in terms of whether it's controlling people at home or whether it's interception. There's a whole series of new powers.
We have the ability to tag people who are thought to be extremist, exclusion orders to keep people who have left and gone to places like Syria to prevent them coming back here. The police and security services have wide-ranging powers in terms of interception, and what we've got to guard against is the security services having so much data and information that they can't then make sense of it. So there's a number of things we've got to do. I think we've got to come together and try to make sure that we move forward here with as much consensus as we possibly can.
Thank you. I want to bring Anne Goodall back in, who asked the question. Anne Goodall.
I think, for me personally, I find it quite disturbing that there's armed police on the streets, but the incident in London would have been shut down a lot sooner if there had been more of them around.
This is, I think, one of the, I'll be perfectly honest about it, it's one of the trickiest balances we've got to strike. We have a police force, not just in Scotland but across the UK, that is routinely unarmed. And my feeling is that is how the majority of people would prefer that it stayed. But we must make sure we've got sufficient numbers of armed police officers to respond to incidents like the one in London. I mean, frankly, the response of the police on Saturday night was exceptional. I mean, all of us should be full of gratitude for the speed and effectiveness with which they responded. Frankly, the police saved, I think, a lot of lives through their response on Saturday night, and we must make sure we support them to do that.
Just before we move on to a different subject, just for clarity, though, you are the third biggest party in Westminster at the moment. You would use your votes to vote against new surveillance powers, new forms of control orders, even if, as they have done in recent years, the security services say that is what they would like.
We would study very carefully proposals that came forward. We voted against the Snoopers Charter because we thought that went too far in interfering with people's civil liberties and didn't practically enhance the police powers in the way that we thought was effective. But we would also always look very carefully and study the case for any proposal for additional powers.
I want to move you on to a subject you'll be even more familiar talking about, the issue of Scottish independence. Hugh Gallagher has a question for us. Mr. Gallagher.
With SNP support falling, do you accept that you miscalculated the mood of Scotland by calling another independence referendum?
Did you miscalculate the mood?
Look, sometimes in politics, you have to do what you think is right. You know, don't get me wrong, all politicians make calculations and tactical calculations, but sometimes you have to be guided by principle. And my position on this is reasonably straightforward when you strip it all away. We face not just Brexit, but perhaps a very extreme form of Brexit that could have implications and consequences for life in Scotland for generations to come. It could see jobs lost, it could see investment into our country fall, it could see the horizons of our young people in terms of freedom of movement seriously restricted. Now, my proposition is simply this. When we get to the end of that Brexit process and we can see what the implications are for the future of our country, we should have a choice. Do we think that is acceptable and right for Scotland, or do we want to choose a different future? Because fundamentally, our future should be decided for us, not by us. Okay. And that's the principle I think
Let's take some views from the audience as well. You, sir.
Just a quick point. I mean, what I would say is that with you, Nicola Sturgeon, you're very good at standing and speaking at your little podium, Butte House, about independence, but when it actually comes to governing the country and tackling the big issues in Scotland, health inequalities, education, social care and those things, the SNP and yourself are hopeless at it.
We're going to give you the chance to address some of that, OK? Back to the back. Yeah, please.
Why have your approval ratings declined by so much? You used to be the most popular First Minister, but ever since you became First Minister, your ratings have gone down and down and down.
And just in front of you?
I just want to raise a point that you made there about our future being decided for you. My girlfriend's in the States right now. I'm training to be a medical student, going on to be a doctor, and I'm about to walk away from the NHS because the Tories are putting in policies, immigration policies, that are not benefiting Scotland. So I think the people of Scotland need to have a say, we need to have a voice, and I think you need to bring that forward as soon as possible.
Well, I think you'd agree with that, but let's agree with the ones that let's focus on the ones you might not agree with. What they're saying is, you announced a second independence referendum, you didn't have to do it, after Brexit, believing that this would be popular, believing this would be the moment that would change it all, and in fact you've become less popular, independence has become less popular.
Can I just perhaps put the polls into context? All of the polls suggest the SNP is on track to win this election in Scotland fairly convincingly. Now, I take nothing for granted. I don't take a single vote for granted. But I think we have to see that in context. But the point that was made by the gentleman here about the responsibilities of the Scottish Government. Now, I don't stand here and say that we don't have challenges to address. But, you know, I was hearing, just as I was waiting to come on, the discussion about the dementia tax. In Scotland, we support free personal and nursing care so that people have less burden on their personal assets when they need care. Our NHS, if you take our accident and emergency departments, best performing of any of the NHS systems in the whole of the UK by a considerable distance. Health spending in Scotland per head of population is 7% higher than it is in the rest of the UK. We've got more doctors, nurses, health professionals than anywhere else in the UK.
We're going to come on to your record
I think we do a good job on these things, but of course we have to continue to make sure we address the challenges we face.
Still on the issue of the independence referendum, for now, because we have other questions coming, I know, on the record of the SNP government. Yeah, sir.
If there was a second vote, should it apply for a minimum period of time, for a generation, like 25, 30 years?
You did, of course, say it would be once in a generation.
Well, look, let me be perfectly frank about this. When we voted in 2014, we were told that voting to stay in the UK protected our place in the European Union, and voting to be independent risked our place in the European Union. Now, less than 3 years later, we find ourselves facing the prospect of Brexit with no real understanding yet what the implications are for lots of aspects of our life. So circumstances change, and my simple proposition is it should be our choice when the time is right and we know what Brexit means for our country to decide what the future of Scotland should be, because the alternative to that...
Are you saying that on the night you lost the referendum, you went to bed thinking, that's it. There won't be another vote like this for decades, not in my lifetime.
If on the night of the referendum and until the Brexit referendum, if you told me I'd be standing here right now talking about another referendum, I would have said that I didn't think that was the case.
Many voters think that that's your whole life and that's all you've spent your time thinking about.
Well, yeah, that's not the... I want what's best for Scotland, and the alternative to not having a choice over our own future is that we have to put up with Brexit regardless of how damaging that is, and that could be narrowed horizons for our young people and lost jobs, tens of thousands of them.
Briefly come back, yeah?
If there was a second vote, would you stipulate for this time that it would apply for a minimum period, so we don't have another one in 4 or 5 years' time?
But I don't think it's right for any politician to dictate to a country what its future should be. I think that should be a choice for the people of Scotland.
So the answer is no. Lady there.
I find the idea of being possibly excluded from the UK and also Europe at the same time exceptionally scary. I think it would give us no control with regards to jobs, and I think there's a lot of people who voted SNP the last time have got that same thoughts. Are we too small a nation to be excluded from Europe and the rest of the UK?
Look, some of the richest and most prosperous countries in the world are countries of a similar size to Scotland, but that is, if that's your view, that's a choice you would make. That is my point. It's a choice for people. But in this election on Thursday, I think we've got a more immediate opportunity as a country to make our voice heard more loudly in the Brexit negotiations, to make sure that our interests are not ignored as Theresa May, assuming it is Theresa May, takes those negotiations forward. Somebody mentioned freedom of movement earlier on. Immigration is a really difficult thing for politicians to talk about because people have concerns. But one of the biggest challenges facing Scotland right now is the need to grow our working age population. If we have the Conservatives putting more and more restrictions on the ability of the best and brightest from around Europe and the world to come here, that will be damaging for our economy, not just now, but for decades to come. And I don't think we should simply accept that.
Do you think it's right that 50.1% of the population voting for independence could forever take us out of the UK?
Well, that comes down to...
Those are the rules,
That comes down to whether you think referendums are the best way to decide these issues.
We're going to come on to Brexit more.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
I feel I am very angry. I'm sitting here and I'm Welsh. I have taught the 1707 Act very often, and in no way does it mention that Scotland is a country. You signed that away. You were glad to join us.
I wasn't alive at the time, I have to say.
I'm talking. I appreciate that. You signed that away, and I feel most annoyed that you are prepared. I was born in Wales to Great Britain, or the UK if you want to call it, in 1933. I am British. I am proud that during the war we fought with Scots and the English.
So you don't want to vote?
I do not want... I want to vote and I don't have one.
Right, man at the front.
Nicola, you made some very valuable points here about the risks of leaving the EU around ability to travel, to work and trade with the rest of the EU. Many, many more of us work and trade and live with the rest of the UK than with the rest of the EU. So surely Skexit is much more dangerous than Brexit.
I don't want people to have to choose between travelling and trading with the rest of the UK and doing that with Europe. I think we should have the ability to do both. And you know, if you listen to Theresa May and David Davis and other UK politicians right now, they say to the Republic of Ireland that they don't have to choose between trading with Europe and trading with the UK. Why should we lose our ability to trade in the biggest single market in the world when tens of thousands of jobs depend on us being able to do that? We should. Well, the point being made to you is important for Scotland and for the rest of the UK.
But the point
Why
being
should we
made,
be forced to choose between these two?
The point being made is that you are losing more trade if you choose to leave the United Kingdom, even than you would be by leaving the EU. I think that's the point that's being raised.
Why on earth would we stop trading with the rest of the UK?
Well, let's hear from the man who asked the question.
Whatsoever that we would stop trading with the rest of the UK.
But surely that then becomes whatever deal you manage to get after Skexit. So if the rest of the UK government said, sorry, hard border, no trade deals, you'd be stuffed.
We've got a UK government right now that is saying to Ireland, rightly, let me make clear, that Brexit doesn't mean a hard border between the north and south of Ireland, that it doesn't mean interruption to trade. The Prime Minister went to Dublin, I think, and said Ireland does not have to choose between trading with Europe and trading with the UK. How is it that they say that to Ireland but try to pretend in Scotland that something different would be the case? We should protect our trade with the UK, but in my view also try to protect our trade within the single market, the biggest single market in the world that is 8 times bigger than the UK market. That's the best of both worlds that Scotland should be seeking to secure.
I didn't give you the chance to defend your policies in government. I want to do that. So let's take another question now from Andrew Couch. Andrew.
You've said that you want to be judged on education, so on that basis, shouldn't you resign?
Just to explain, Andrew, obviously people here in an audience in Edinburgh know what you're talking about, but why? What is it about the educational record that you think raises questions for the First Minister?
I think that on a number of measures, the Scottish education system, which used to be regarded as probably the best in Britain, is now, worst. And I think that there've also been misjudgments around things like the funding of free tuition fees, which are paid for by other ways that damage students.
Just to remind people, of course, that health and education devolved policies, so they are determined by your government.
Well, firstly, I will defend free university tuition. I got the chance to go to university because education was free. I don't think I've got the right to take that away from anybody, and we've got more young people now in Scotland going to university than ever before, including more young people from our most deprived communities. Now, I stood for the Scottish Parliament election last year, seeking to be First Minister, and said that over the course of the Scottish Parliament, my priority was to raise standards in our schools and close the attainment gap. And we are working to do that through a range of different reforms and additional investment direct in our schools to head teachers to allow them to deploy the additional staff or whatever other resources they think is necessary. So
as you know, in the internationally recognised PISA rankings, Scotland recorded its worst ever results last year for reading, maths and science. That doesn't leave a great deal, does it?
Absolutely. These figures are 2 years old. They are what actually
all figures are old, aren't they, First Minister? All figures look at the past.
They are what sparked me making that commitment, and I will be when we come to contest the next Scottish Parliament elections. If I'm asking people to vote for me again as First Minister, I expect to be judged on that. But, you know, and it's absolutely legitimate for me to be asked these questions and answer them. But on Thursday, we're not choosing a Scottish Government. We're choosing MPs who will go to Westminster and vote on public spending. Whether the money available to invest in our schools and hospitals goes up or down, we'll elect MPs to go to Westminster to decide whether the social security cuts that the Tories want to impose, that are going to drive hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million more children across the UK into poverty. And we need to make sure we've got strong voices arguing for the right things on that.
Do you think that forcing through the draconian Named Persons Act will improve educational results? Do you think actually you should be focusing on what is important?
Let's bring in a gentleman here.
Yeah, can I just make a point that with regards to higher education, I mean, even though you've got free education, which, to be honest, I don't think it is free because we're all paying for it as taxpayers, the point is that it's having the perverse effect of rationing places for Scottish students in order for non-Scottish students to pay for that. And secondly, also, the evidence is also showing that regardless of with England having fees, there are in fact more deprived students per percentage compared to Scotland actually going to university. So therefore, free education is not.
So in other words, internationally recognised stats show that England is more successful in getting deprived young people into university than Scotland, even though the SNP abolished tuition.
I don't want to be too technical here, but the stats are not directly comparable. More young people than in Scotland than in England do higher education and further education colleges. That's not included in the stats. But we've got more Scottish students going to university now than ever before. We've got more places than ever before for Scottish students, and the gap between the richest and the poorest is starting to narrow. We need to do more. But young people in England are coming out of university with £27,000 of debt just from tuition fees. So young people who come out of university in Scotland have much lower debt to take into the start of their working life. I think education should be based on your ability to learn, not on your ability to pay, and I think it's important we protect that principle.
Now Can I just clarify something? It was quoted to you by the questioner that you said it was your top priority and you'd resign if you didn't get it right. I think you were saying, well, I might have to resign, but not just now. That might be before the Scottish parliamentary election.
Well, with the greatest respect, I was elected as First Minister in the Scottish Parliament election last year. I put forward a manifesto for a 5-year term, and at the heart of that manifesto was our priorities in education.
Okay.
So yes, I do think when we come to the next Scottish Parliament election, I should be judged and held to account on that. I think that is absolutely right. But on Thursday, we're electing MPs, hopefully to go to Westminster, to protect public spending and stop the Tories pushing more kids into poverty, which will make it more difficult for us to improve attainment in our schools.
Sorry to cut you off.
I just want to stick with education, and I actually want to say that I was quite angry to hear a gentleman earlier saying that Nicola Sturgeon got it wrong with tuition fees. I'm a first-generation student. No one in my family has been to university before myself, and I would never have got there without free tuition for myself. So I'm outraged to suggest that that's wrong.
Move on. You made your point powerfully, but the First Minister's addressed tuition fees. So we're going to move on to another question, if we could. It is a question on the issue of tax, and Alistair Drummond. Alistair Drummond.
How can you support increasing top rate taxes for the UK, but not use your devolved powers to raise Scottish taxes?
Just to remind people of the powers, if you wouldn't mind, which is the Scottish Government does have power and has had since 1999 to raise the level of income tax, and more recently has had wider powers to raise the top level of tax as well.
Yeah, on the top level of tax, we have the power to set the rate. What we don't have power over in Scotland are the rules around tax avoidance. So we don't have the ability to set rules that would stop people moving their income south of the border or moving their income into capital gains. So we took advice, and the advice was that if that was introduced in Scotland alone, then we would risk not raising more revenue, but actually seeing a decline in the revenue we raised. So that's why we didn't do it in Scotland alone. I think it should be done across the UK, and if it's done in the rest of the UK, we would do that here in Scotland as well, because we could be more confident then of raising extra revenue for our schools and hospitals. There's no point setting a tax if you're going to come out with less money at the end of it.
Mr Drummond?
But surely, if we had independence, it would be in exactly the same situation.
No, absolutely not, because with independence we would have full powers over the rules around tax avoidance, we'd have full powers over tax. We've got the power only to set the rate of income tax. We don't have any of the other powers that go around creating the whole of the tax system.
But you saying after these many years of people campaigning for greater powers, first for a Scottish Parliament and then greater powers for that Scottish Parliament, they're pointless. These tax powers are unusable.
No, I think they should, on that particular issue, they have to be fuller in order to allow us to use them solely in Scotland with confidence.
So it's a great argument that was had about extra powers, and you don't want to use them in any way.
Well, no, that's not true, because we're not raising the basic rate of income tax at a time when inflation is rising. I don't think it's right to ask low and middle income earners to pay more, but we have decided to take a different approach on the higher rate of income tax. So again, unlike the Conservatives at Westminster, we're not giving a tax cut to people who pay the higher rate of tax. Instead, we're investing that revenue in our schools and hospitals, and I think that's absolutely the right thing to do.
Yes, please.
I'd just like to move on for a second, because our politicians south have been talking quite a lot about mental health.
Could we talk about tax, if you wouldn't mind? I can bring you back
in
a second. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
The First Minister raises an argument that we won't raise additional revenue if we raise the top rate of tax, and I actually support that argument. But in terms of the land and buildings tax, you raised it and you've damaged the Scottish property market.
Yeah, but there we are. Yeah.
Regarding the 50p tax rate, is it not just true that you'd want the 50p tax rate to affect London and the South East and then receive more money from the Barnett family?
That's not how it works. That's not how it works. What I'm saying is if it's introduced in the rest of the UK, we would introduce it in Scotland as well. I want to have full powers over tax in Scotland, but right now, if we do it in Scotland alone, because we couldn't prevent people shifting their incomes, then we'd run the risk of losing money. And surely common sense tells you, if the advice says that you might lose money by putting a tax up, it would not be the most sensible thing to do.
Okay, I want to give you the chance to answer your question, because you wanted to change the subject onto mental health. Yes,
Thank
please.
you very much.
Yeah.
I just want you to ask if perhaps we can move one step forward from many pledges that we hear about mental health, and have a mental health committee with MPs and patients alike working together to scrutinise and advise on policies that are going to have direct impact on their lives.
Yeah, I mean, that is something I will take away and give consideration to. We do try to consult patient groups and consult organisations that work with patient groups before formulating policy in any area, but it's particularly important in health matters, and I think probably particularly important when it comes to mental health. We're investing a lot to try and improve mental health services just now. One of the good things I think we should all be positive about is that more and more people come forward for mental health help now because the stigma around it is reducing, and that's something that is good, but it puts more demand on services. So we've got a real obligation to invest, but I'll certainly take your suggestion about looking at how we formalise the patient input.
Sorry to cut you off. Time just for one last main question. Yes. Could I get the question, please, from Gillian May?
Yeah. Would the SNP be prepared to compromise on an independence referendum and join a coalition with another party to stop the Conservatives from winning?
Just to be clear, when you say compromise, what exactly do you mean?
Well, put it on the back burner for the time being.
First Minister.
I've set out my position on an independence referendum, but I certainly would want to be part of an alliance, a more progressive alliance, if the arithmetic allowed it, that would keep the Conservatives out of power. Part of an alliance that would invest in public services and end the cuts to the support for the most vulnerable in our society.
But if they said they could only work with you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's the question. They could only work with you if you said no to a referendum, not forever, but maybe for the period of a parliament, for 5 years.
Well, look, I think at the end of the Brexit process, people in Scotland should have a choice, and I've already set out why I think that's the case.
You happy with the answer?
And you know,
no, what?
Surely
I think you're losing a lot of votes. I think you're losing a lot of votes from SNP supporters by continuing with the independence referendum at this time.
Because, and then I'll give the First Minister a chance to reply.
Yeah, because, well, some people just don't want it. They think it's not the right time for it because of everything else that's going on.
I'm not proposing it now. I'm absolutely not proposing it now. I accept that point. But
when are you proposing it?
At the end of the process, when we know what
when is the end of the process?
Of Brexit. Well, I don't know that because I'm not in charge of the process.
No, but you used to be clear about it. You say spring 19, and you're not so clear now.
Theresa May tells us that the deal will be done before the UK exits. Now, if that's the case, that's the end of the process. We know what the deal is. If that's not the case, then clearly that timetable would be longer.
But she talked last weekend of a transitional deal of a year or two. Could it be
she talks about a lot of things
2020,
and isn't always
21,
consistent in what she talks
22.
about. I think trying to keep up with Theresa May's positions in this election has become quite difficult on a whole range of different things. But can I come back to your point about a progressive alliance, to use that terminology? I would want to be part of that if it was possible. But do you know what? I think, looking at the polls, unfortunately the Conservatives are still likely to win this election, but it's no longer inevitable, in my view, that Theresa May gets a bigger majority, and that's a choice for Scotland. Do we vote for MPs that stop Theresa May increasing her majority or not? And I think we should.
The party election broadcast. Last very quick question.
You say you want independence to take us back into the European Union. Can I ask you...
I'm afraid.
Okay, can I ask you whether you would commit here today to the Scottish fishermen that you will not barter away their fishing resources to join the EU or a single market?
I and the SNP and people before me in the SNP have argued against the common fisheries policy. We've argued for it to be scrapped or fundamentally reformed. It's the Tories, time after time after time, that have sold out Scottish fishermen, and believe me, they're shaping up to do it all over again.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time now. You could have half an hour on the future of fisheries policy, so thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank Nicola Sturgeon. Thank you very much indeed. That's all we've got time for tonight on this Question Time special. David will be back on Friday, the night after the election, for a special programme. But until then, from us here in Edinburgh, from me, from the First Minister as well, thank you for watching.